The storm came without warning. One moment the sky above the Yorkshire moors was bruised purple at the edges, the kind of color that old farmers read like scripture. The next, rain was hammering the roof of the carriage so violently that Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had to press 2 fingers against his temple just to think clearly. "Slow down, Higgins!" he called through the window panel. The coachman obeyed. The horses were already nervous, their hooves slipping against the wet stone of the country road. Nathaniel let the velvet curtain fall and leaned back against the cushioned seat. His jacket, charcoal wool, brass-buttoned, freshly pressed that morning by his valet, now felt suffocating in the thick, damp air. He loosened his cravat and exhaled slowly. He had spent the past 3 days at Lord Pembury's county gathering in Harrogate, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with men whose conversations bored him thoroughly. Talk of grain prices and inheritance disputes. He was 34 years old, a duke, and apparently expected to find this stimulating. He did not. The estate awaited him, cold, quiet, and almost entirely empty of anyone whose company he genuinely valued. That was when Higgins's voice came sharp from above. "Your Grace, there is someone on the road!" Nathaniel pulled the curtain aside. Through the hammering rain and the swinging lantern light, he spotted her, a young woman standing alone at the crossroads. She was not running for shelter. She was not crouching beneath a tree. She simply stood there, a wicker basket hanging from one arm, her dark cloak drenched through and clinging to her shoulders. At her feet, a few pale roses had fallen from the basket and lay scattered in the mud like dropped handkerchiefs. She was watching the carriage approach with an expression of complete calm. No panic, no desperation, only the quiet alertness of someone who had been expecting something. Nathaniel found himself stepping out before Higgins had fully brought the horses to a halt. The rain hit him immediately, cold, relentless, and deeply undignified for a man of his position. He did not particularly care. "You cannot stand here in this weather," he said, raising his voice above the wind. "There is a village 2 miles east. Allow us to convey you there." The woman regarded him for a moment. Her face was pale and sharp-featured, not beautiful in the fashionable sense, but striking in a way that made him feel as though he had interrupted something private. "I am quite all right, Your Grace," she said. "Thank you." He stopped. He had not introduced himself. There were no crests visible on the carriage doors. He had them covered for travel, a habit developed after a particularly unpleasant confrontation with a creditor 2 summers prior. And yet she had addressed him correctly, without hesitation. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. She did not confirm or deny it. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, rain running freely down her cheek, and asked something that pulled the ground out from under him. "Your Grace, are you traveling to Ashford Manor tonight by the northern road or the lower bridge crossing?" The lower bridge. That was precisely his planned route. He had arranged it with Higgins that morning specifically to avoid the longer northern detour. "Why do you ask?" he said carefully. Before she could answer, the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the rain. Not one horse, several, moving fast. Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not quite fear, but a sudden sharp attention, the way a hawk looks when it hears movement below. "Please take the northern road tonight, Your Grace," she said quietly. Then she picked up the roses from the mud with one swift motion, turned, and walked directly into the darkened tree line beside the road. Nathaniel stood in the rain, staring at the space where she had been. "Your Grace," Higgins called down from the box. "Shall I proceed?" The riders passed without incident. 3 men, traveling fast, not even glancing at the carriage. They were gone inside a minute. Nathaniel climbed back in. His coat was soaked through. He sat in silence for a long moment. "Take the northern road," he said at last. Higgins paused. "That route adds near 40 minutes, sir." "I am aware." They arrived at Ashford Manor well past midnight. Nathaniel had almost convinced himself the encounter was nothing more than an unusual moment on a strange night, perhaps a local woman who had heard his name somewhere and had an odd manner about her. Then his head steward, Partridge, met him at the door with a lantern and a grave expression. "Dreadful news reached us an hour ago, Your Grace," Partridge said. "The lower bridge crossing collapsed this evening, shortly after sunset. Apparently the foundations gave way. 2 supply wagons went into the river." Nathaniel stood in the doorway, rain still dripping from his coat onto the stone floor. "Were the drivers shaken badly, but alive by God's mercy? The bridge, though, is completely gone." Partridge shook his head. "Had anyone taken a full carriage across in the dark tonight, I fear we would not be discussing it so calmly." Nathaniel said nothing. He walked slowly to the study, poured himself a measure of brandy, and stood by the window watching the rain streak the glass. The northern road had added 40 minutes and saved his life. A flower woman standing alone at a crossroads in a storm had known the bridge would collapse. She had known his name without being told, and she had vanished into the dark as though she had never existed at all. He set the brandy down without drinking it. He was going to find her. 4 days passed. Nathaniel told himself he had practical reasons for traveling to Whitby. Coastal trade matters required his attention, a dispute between 2 merchant partners whose contracts ran through Ashford land, correspondence that had been sitting unanswered on his desk for a fortnight. These were legitimate obligations. He repeated this to himself twice on the morning of departure, while Partridge helped him into his traveling coat. Partridge, who had served the Ashford household for 23 years, said nothing, but his expression suggested he was not entirely convinced either. The road to Whitby wound through moorland before dropping toward the coast, and when the sea finally appeared, gray and vast and restless beneath an autumn sky, Nathaniel felt something loosen in his chest. He had always found the Yorkshire coast clarifying in a way that London and its drawing rooms never were. The air was sharper here. The noise of expectation that followed a duke everywhere tended to get blown away by the wind off the water. The harbor was crowded by mid-morning. Fishing vessels knocked against their moorings, their masts swaying in the breeze. Merchants argued over crates. Sailors carried rope and barrels and shouted things at one another across the dockside with the easy rudeness of men who had worked together for years. Nathaniel moved through it all with his collar turned against the wind, his steward Graves walking 2 paces behind him, carrying the relevant correspondence. He had been on the docks perhaps 20 minutes when he saw her. She was standing outside a harborside inn called the Anchor and Crown, a basket of flowers over one arm, calling out to passers-by in a pleasant, unhurried voice. Fresh-cut chrysanthemums and late autumn roses, white and yellow, bright against the grey morning. She looked entirely at ease. She looked entirely ordinary. Nathaniel stopped walking so abruptly that Graves nearly stepped into his back. It was her. The same woman from the crossroads. The same composed expression, the same quiet watchfulness beneath the surface of it. He approached directly because he had spent 4 days thinking about this moment and had decided that indirectness would gain him nothing. "You told me at the crossroads that we had not met," he said, "and yet here you are." She looked up at him. If his appearance surprised her, she gave no indication of it whatsoever. "I think you may have mistaken me for someone else, sir," she said pleasantly. "Chrysanthemums? They are particularly fresh this morning." "I have not mistaken you for anyone." He kept his voice low. Around them, the dock continued its noise and motion. "You knew my name 4 nights ago on the Harrogate Road. You warned me away from the lower bridge crossing." She held his gaze steadily and said nothing. "The bridge collapsed that evening," he said. "My carriage would have been on it." Something moved very briefly behind her eyes. Not guilt, not surprise. Something closer to acknowledgement, the look of a person confirming privately that a thing they hoped had worked did, in fact, work. It was gone in an instant. "I am glad you are well, sir," she said. "Will that be all?" Before he could press further, he noticed something. A dock worker in a heavy canvas jacket approached the stall, exchanged a coin for a small bunch of white chrysanthemums, and as the woman placed the flowers in his rough hand, a folded piece of paper passed between them in the opposite direction. Clean. Practiced. If Nathaniel had not been watching her specifically, he would have seen nothing but a flower purchase. The dock worker moved on without looking back. Within the next few minutes, it happened twice more. A boy of perhaps 14, running errands by the look of him. Then an older woman in a merchant's widow's dress, who paused only long enough to admire the roses. Each time, a note changed hands. Nathaniel kept his expression carefully neutral. He bought a single white rose, mostly to give himself a reason to remain standing there, and was trying to formulate his next question when a shout erupted from further down the harbor. Smoke, black and sudden, pouring from the upper windows of a warehouse 30 yards along the dock front. Someone screamed. A bell began ringing. Men ran in competing directions, some toward the fire and some firmly away from it, and within moments the entire harbor was in an uproar of shouting and movement and the alarming crackle of burning timber carried on the sea wind. Nathaniel turned instinctively toward the smoke. When he turned back, the flower stall was empty. The basket was gone. The flowers were gone. She was gone. He stood there, holding a single white rose, while smoke rose above the rooftops, and the harbor bell rang on and on into the cold morning air. Graves appeared at his elbow, looking flustered, and asking whether they ought to move the carriage away from the dock road. Nathaniel looked at the rose in his hand. She had not denied knowing him this time. Not really. She had deflected, redirected, and then vanished at the first opportunity, too smoothly for it to be accidental, too quickly for it to be mere coincidence. The notes, the dock worker, the widow, the boy. This woman was not selling flowers. She was collecting something, and whatever it was, someone out there clearly did not want it collected. The invitation to Ravenshire Hall had been sitting on Nathaniel's writing desk for 11 days. He had intended to decline it. Lord Cavendish's autumn balls were grand, exhausting affairs, 300 guests minimum, music that continued until 2 in the morning, and an unspoken expectation that unmarried dukes would make themselves agreeable to at least 4 or 5 eligible young ladies before the supper interval. Nathaniel had attended twice before, and left both times feeling like a horse being assessed at auction. But something made him accept this time. He could not have explained it precisely. A feeling, perhaps. The same instinct that had made him step out of his carriage into the rain at the crossroads. He had learned, in the past week, to pay closer attention to that instinct. Ravenshire Hall sat in the hills above Northumberland like something from a painting. Lit from every window, its stone facade golden against the night sky, carriages arriving in a steady stream along the torchlit drive. Inside, the great ballroom was everything such rooms were designed to be. Chandelier light fracturing across silk gowns and polished floors, the string quartet playing something Viennese, the air thick with perfume, candle smoke, and the particular self-importance of the English aristocracy gathered in one place. Nathaniel accepted a glass of claret from a footman and positioned himself near one of the tall windows. He was perfectly capable of performing the social requirements of an evening like this. He smiled when smiled at, discussed the harvest with a baronet, complimented Lady Cavendish on the floral arrangements, and all the while watched the room with the careful attention he had recently discovered he possessed and had previously wasted. The floral arrangements. His eyes moved to the far end of the ballroom, where 2 large arrangements of white lilies and winter roses stood on either side of the entrance to the supper room. A young woman in a plain gray dress, serving staff clearly, her hair pinned severely back beneath a white cap, was adjusting the stems of the nearest arrangement with quiet concentration. He knew the line of those shoulders before he saw her face. He set his claret down on the nearest surface. She was dressed as a household servant, convincingly enough that not a single guest had looked twice at her. The gray dress was slightly too large. The white cap sat low on her forehead. She moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that servants in grand houses are looked through rather than looked at. Nathaniel began moving toward her, keeping his pace unhurried, nodding once at a colonel who caught his eye across the room. He was perhaps 15 feet away when two gentlemen positioned near the supper room entrance drew his attention, not deliberately, but because one of them raised his voice slightly, in the careless way that men do when they are certain no one of consequence is listening. "The northern shipments move Thursday," said the taller of the two, a broad man in a dark military coat whose name Nathaniel did not know. "Carlisle first, then down through Durham. Hartley has confirmed the route." The other man, older, in a bottle green tailcoat, nodded once and said something too quiet to catch. Nathaniel slowed without stopping. Military shipments. Northern routes. He filed it away and kept walking. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds. The woman in the gray dress turned from the floral arrangement with a small jug of water in one hand, ostensibly to water the stems, and moved toward the two gentlemen to attend to the second arrangement behind them. Her foot caught the edge of a decorative rug, the jug tilted. A generous measure of red wine, taken from a glass on the nearby table, in one smooth motion he almost missed, splashed directly across the bottle-green tailcoat of the older gentleman. The man lurched backward with an exclamation of outrage. The woman produced apologies in a breathless torrent, dabbing uselessly at his coat with a cloth, her hands moving in rapid, flustered gestures around his jacket. When she stepped back, her expression was pure mortification. The document she had lifted from his inside breast pocket was no longer visible anywhere. Nathaniel had watched the entire thing. He was fairly certain he was the only person in the room who had. He reached the supper room doorway just as she slipped through it. He followed immediately, stepping into the quieter corridor beyond, where the music became muffled and the candlelight thinner. She was already moving quickly toward the servants' passage at the far end. "Clara Whitmore," he said. He did not know why he said it. He had not known her name until the word left his mouth, and yet the moment she stopped walking, he understood that he had somehow been right. She turned slowly. For the first time since the crossroads, she looked at him without deflection. No pleasantries, no misdirection, just a long, steady assessment, as though she were deciding something important. "You have been following me," she said quietly. "You have been appearing in front of me," he replied. A door opened somewhere further down the corridor. Voices approached from the servants' wing. Whatever she had been about to say, she swallowed it. She glanced once at the approaching sound, then back at him. "Not here," she said. Then she stepped into the shadows of the servants' passage and was gone again. But this time, Nathaniel noticed something she had not intended to leave behind. On the stone floor where she had stood, a single white chrysanthemum lay at his feet, the same flower from the Whitby docks. It was not accidental. It was a signal. The chrysanthemum told him where to look. It took him 2 days to understand this, and another half-day of riding between coaching inns along the Durham Road before the pattern became clear. White chrysanthemums. They appeared in small bunches on windowsills of specific inns, tucked into the frames of stable doors, left casually on the counters of posting houses where horses were changed and letters collected. Always white, always fresh enough to have been placed that morning. Someone was marking a route. Nathaniel followed it. He traveled without Graves this time, taking only his personal manservant, a quiet Yorkshireman named Dodd, who had the excellent quality of asking no unnecessary questions. They moved between inns across Durham and the roads north toward Newcastle, stopping wherever the white flowers appeared, watching, listening. What he found was not reassuring. At the Black Horse Inn outside Durham City, he sat nursing a tankard of ale for 2 hours and overheard a conversation between a carrier and a man in a wool merchant's coat that referenced a consignment of goods moving without proper toll documentation through the northern roads. At the Greyhound posting house, closer to Chesterley Street, the innkeeper's wife mentioned casually to another woman that 3 gentlemen had taken private rooms for a week, paid in advance, and had not once come down for meals with the other guests. At a smaller inn near Birtley, barely more than a farmhouse with 2 spare rooms and a smoky hearth, Nathaniel found the stable boy unusually nervous, unwilling to meet his eyes, and a fresh set of hoofprints in the mud of the yard that suggested a large group of riders had passed through well before dawn. Flower sellers had preceded him at every single stop. He learned this gradually from innkeepers and serving girls and ostlers who mentioned them offhandedly. A woman selling flowers who had passed through yesterday or that morning or 2 days prior. Always moving, always alone or in pairs, always quiet and pleasant and completely unremarkable. On the 4th day, he found her. The inn at Lanchester was modest and clean, set back from the road behind a low stone wall. Nathaniel arrived in the early evening when the taproom was beginning to fill with working men coming off the roads. He took a seat near the fire, ordered supper, and was halfway through a bowl of mutton broth when Clara Whitmore sat down across the table from him as though she had been expected. She had abandoned the gray servant's dress. She wore a plain dark traveling coat, sensible boots, and her hair pulled back simply beneath a bonnet that had seen considerable weather. She looked less like a woman in disguise and more like herself, though Nathaniel was aware he did not yet know what herself actually meant. She looked at his bowl of broth. "You followed the flowers," she said. "You left them to be followed," he replied. She considered this for a moment, then apparently decided that arguing the point would waste both their time. "You are more persistent than I expected, Your Grace." "You saved my life on a country road in a rainstorm," he said. "I find that tends to hold my attention." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, closer to a reluctant acknowledgement that she was not going to be rid of him through misdirection alone. She folded her hands on the table and spoke quietly beneath the noise of the taproom. "There is a network," she said. "Women mostly. Flower sellers, seamstresses, ladies' maids, inn servants. We travel routes that men in official positions never think to watch because no one watches women carrying baskets. We carry information, documents, messages, intelligence gathered from conversations that powerful men have in front of us because they do not believe we are listening." Nathaniel said nothing. He let her continue. "We have been operating for 11 years. We have exposed 2 smuggling rings, a fraudulent land scheme that would have displaced 400 tenant families, and a magistrate who was taking payments to imprison men on false charges." She said all of this without pride, as a simple recounting of facts. "The authorities received the evidence anonymously each time. They took the credit. We continued working." "Who leads this network?" Nathaniel asked. "I cannot tell you that." "Who do you ultimately serve?" "I cannot tell you that either." He studied her face. She was not being evasive for the pleasure of it. There was something careful in her restraint, the caution of someone who had learned through experience exactly how much trust cost when it was given to the wrong person. "The notes at Whitby," he said. "What were you collecting?" "Evidence of a cargo scheme, goods being moved through the harbor without Crown documentation, the kind of arrangement that funds larger operations." "Larger than smuggling?" She met his eyes directly for the first time, without any deflection behind them. "Yes," she said, "considerably larger." Before he could ask the next question, the inn door opened with a gust of cold air. Clara glanced toward it, a quick, reflexive movement, and whatever she saw in the doorway made her jaw tighten very slightly. She rose from the table calmly, as though finishing a perfectly ordinary meal. "Ride for London, Your Grace," she said quietly, "and do not take the eastern approach." She was gone before he could stand. Nathaniel turned toward the door. The two men who had just entered wore no livery, no uniform, nothing to identify them, but they were looking directly at the chair where Clara had been sitting, and one of them was the broad man in the military coat from Ravenshire Hall. London in late autumn wore its wealth and its misery in equal measure. Nathaniel arrived 3 days after leaving Lanchester, having taken Clara's advice about the eastern approach and consequently spent an additional night at a posting house in Hertfordshire that smelled of tallow candles and damp timber. He did not complain. The two men from the inn doorway had followed his carriage for nearly 6 miles before turning off at a crossroads, and that had been unpleasant enough without adding a potential ambush on a dark road outside the city. He took rooms at his usual London townhouse on Grosvenor Street, told his household staff he was in the city on estate business, and waited. Clara appeared on the second evening. She arrived not through the front door, but through the tradesman's entrance at the rear of the house, accompanied by a woman Nathaniel had never seen. Older, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the upright bearing of someone accustomed to command. Clara introduced her only as Margaret. No surname was offered, and Nathaniel understood better than to ask for one. They sat in his study, with the curtains drawn and a fire burning low, and what Clara and Margaret laid before him across the next 2 hours dismantled several assumptions he had held about the stability of his country. It began with names: Lord Viscount Ellery, Sir Edmund Barstow, a retired Major General named Croft, 2 industrialists whose foundries and coal operations ran through the northern counties, men named Hale and Presswick, whose wealth was considerable and whose public reputations were entirely without blemish. These men, Clara explained, had been meeting privately for the better part of 2 years. The meetings moved: a private dining room in a St. James's Club 1 month, a country estate in Derbyshire the next, a rented property near the Newcastle docks the month after that. Clara's network had been tracking them for 8 months, piecing together fragments of conversation and intercepted correspondence into something coherent and deeply troubling. Their plan, as far as Clara's network had been able to determine, ran in 3 stages. The first involved disrupting trade and supply routes through the northern counties, creating shortages, inflating prices, destabilizing the livelihoods of tenant farmers and small merchants who depended on reliable movement of goods. This was already underway. The toll irregularities, the missing shipments, the suspicious warehouse fire at Whitby. These were not isolated incidents. The second stage involved exploiting that instability. Ellery had connections inside 2 government offices. The correspondence Clara had lifted from the bottle-green coat at Ravenshire Hall had confirmed this. Men in positions of authority had been receiving payments. In return, complaints from affected northern landowners and merchants would be quietly buried, investigations delayed, and the chaos allowed to deepen. The third stage was the one that made Nathaniel set down his brandy glass and stare at the fire for a long moment before speaking. Barstow and the 2 industrialists had been acquiring land, quietly, through intermediaries, at prices that only made sense if the sellers were desperate. Estates whose owners had been financially ruined by the manufactured disruption in the north would be purchased for a fraction of their value. The plan was not political in the grand sense. It was not revolution or sedition in any noble form. It was greed, constructed with the patience and precision of men who understood that economic chaos, properly managed, was more profitable than any single scheme. "They are destroying the North to buy it," Nathaniel said. "At pennies on the pound," Margaret said. Her voice was dry and precise. "And several of those estates border Crown lands, which creates complications of a different order entirely." Clara spread 3 documents on the desk. Copies, she said, the originals secured elsewhere. Letters in Ellery's hand. A ledger page showing payments to 2 named officials. A shipping manifest with annotations that matched no legitimate cargo Nathaniel had ever seen recorded. "How long have you known the full extent of this?" he asked. "We have suspected the shape of it for 4 months," Clara said. "We have had enough evidence to act for approximately 3 weeks." "Then why haven't you?" She glanced at Margaret. Margaret answered. "Because 3 weeks ago, 2 members of our network disappeared. A woman in Newcastle, another in Carlisle. Both were on routes connected to this investigation." She paused. "They have not been found." The fire crackled. Rain tapped the window glass. "Someone told them," Nathaniel said. "Someone inside," Clara said quietly. "We do not know who, which means we cannot take what we have to any official channel until we are certain of who receives it." Nathaniel looked at the documents on his desk. Then he looked at Clara, at the steadiness in her face, the exhaustion she was clearly refusing to show, the weight she had been carrying for months across coaching inns and harbor docks and grand ballrooms in a gray servant's dress. He thought about a bridge collapsing in the dark, a single white rose held in his hand while harbor bells rang. "You came to me," he said. "You followed the flowers," she replied. "And you took the northern road." It was not an explanation. It was something more than that. Outside, London carried on its evening business, entirely unaware that, in a study on Grosvenor Street, 2 very different people had just decided to trust one another with something considerably larger than either of them. It was Margaret who suggested Ashford Manor. London, she argued, was too exposed. The townhouse on Grosvenor Street had already been compromised, a fact confirmed the morning after their meeting when Nathaniel's footman reported finding a man loitering in the rear lane who fled the moment he was approached. Someone knew Nathaniel was in the city. Someone knew which house. The manor offered space, distance, and the particular advantage of being surrounded by land that Nathaniel knew intimately, and strangers did not. Clara agreed with visible reluctance. Nathaniel suspected she found the idea of accepting his protection professionally uncomfortable. A woman who had operated invisibly for years, suddenly dependent on the hospitality of a duke. He said nothing about this. He simply arranged the carriages. They left London before dawn, separately, taking different roads north and meeting at a pre-arranged point outside Doncaster. Margaret traveled independently with 2 other women from the network, carrying the original documents in a method she declined to specify. Clara rode in Nathaniel's second carriage with the curtains drawn, and they did not speak much during the journey. When they did, it was practical. Routes, timing, what staff at the manor could be trusted. Ashford Manor received them quietly. Partridge met them at the door with his usual composure, asked no questions about the young woman accompanying his grace, and had rooms prepared within the hour. Nathaniel had always valued Partridge for exactly this quality. The first 2 days passed in careful, concentrated work. Nathaniel's library became their base of operations, maps spread across the reading table, documents arranged in sequence. Clara worked with a methodical precision that impressed him. She could hold the thread of a complex argument across multiple pieces of evidence and identify the weakest points in their case with the instinct of someone who had done this work for years in far more difficult circumstances than a well-appointed library. They were close to having something complete enough to act upon. Then, on the 3rd morning, Nathaniel came downstairs to find Clara standing very still in the doorway of the library. The maps were there. The correspondence they had compiled was there. The 3 copied documents, the letters, the ledger page, the shipping manifest, were gone. He searched the room thoroughly, then the adjoining rooms, then had Dodd search his own chambers. Nothing. The documents had not been mislaid. They had been removed cleanly, without disturbance to anything else in the room. Whoever had taken them knew precisely what they were looking for. Clara's face was white, but her voice was level. "The originals are still with Margaret. We have not lost everything." "We have lost our working copies and 3 days of compiled notes," Nathaniel said. He called the household together. 12 staff members assembled in the entrance hall: footmen, kitchen staff, housemaids, Partridge, Dodd. Nathaniel looked at each face in turn and felt the particular coldness of suspecting people he had known for years. It was not a face that gave it away. It was a pair of boots. Dodd noticed it first, quietly, while the others were being dismissed. He drew Nathaniel aside and mentioned, without drama, that the understeward Hicks had mud on his boots, consistent with the path that ran along the east side of the manor toward the old gamekeeper's road, the back route that connected the estate to the Durham Turnpike without passing the gatehouse. Someone had used that path last night. Nathaniel found Hicks in the harness room, making a show of inspecting bridle leather. The man was perhaps 40, had served the estate for 6 years, and had always been quietly efficient. He looked up when Nathaniel entered, and his expression did something small and irreversible, a fractional tightening around the eyes that lasted less than a second. It was enough. The full account came out within the hour, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady, patient questioning that Nathaniel suspected Clara had taught him, simply by example, over the past week. Hicks had been approached 4 months ago by an intermediary he knew only as a solicitor's clerk from Durham. He had been paid, not a spectacular sum, but enough to matter to a man on an understeward's wages, to report on Nathaniel's movements and any unusual visitors to the estate. He had not known about the documents specifically. He had simply sent word that papers were being studied in the library. That word had been enough. Nathaniel had Hicks secured in the estate office under Dodd's supervision and returned to the library to find Clara gone. His stomach dropped. He found Partridge in the corridor, pale and unusually shaken. 2 men had come over the east wall of the manor grounds 20 minutes prior. They had intercepted Clara near the rose garden on the south lawn. Nathaniel did not wait for his coat. He ran. He came through the south garden door at full speed and saw them. 2 figures dragging Clara toward the perimeter wall, a third man holding horses beyond the gate. Clara was fighting with a ferocity that had slowed them considerably. "Stop!" Nathaniel's voice came out with an authority he had never quite used before. It bought 3 seconds. Enough. He reached them, pulled the nearer man backward by his collar, and in the brief chaos that followed, Clara broke free. They ran. Not to the house was compromised. To the east lawn, where Nathaniel knew the old tunnel entrance sat beneath a collapsed garden folly, hidden under 20 years of ivy and his own deliberate neglect. He pulled the ivy back, and they went underground. Above them, boots crossed the gravel. Below, there was only darkness and the sound of their own breathing. The tunnel smelled of earth and old stone, and something faintly metallic, like rainwater that had been sitting in the dark for years. Nathaniel had discovered it as a boy of perhaps 9, following a wounded fox through the ivy on a dare from a stable hand who had not believed it existed. He had told no one about it then, and in 25 years had told no one since. It ran beneath the east lawn and emerged through a stone drainage outlet in the slope of the hill behind the estate, roughly 300 yards from the manor walls. Long enough to matter tonight. He went first, crouching low where the ceiling dipped, one hand trailing the wall. Clara followed close behind without complaint or question. The sounds from above faded quickly, replaced by the hollow quiet of underground and the distant rhythm of water moving somewhere deeper in the hill. When they emerged into open air, the night was clear and brutally cold, stars sharp overhead. No moon yet. They crouched in the frost-stiff grass at the base of the hill and listened. No pursuit. Not yet. "Your horse," Clara said quietly. "Stabled in the east block. We cannot go back." She nodded once, and they moved. They walked for 2 hours across open moorland before Nathaniel's knowledge of the estate's outer boundaries led them to a tenant farmer named Greaves, who had worked Ashford land for 30 years. Greaves asked no questions, gave them 2 horses, a blanket each, and a loaf of bread from his kitchen table, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who had known the Ashford family long enough to understand that unusual requests at unusual hours occasionally happened and were not his business to interrogate. They rode north, not toward any city, toward the high moors, where roads thinned and strangers were noticed and pursuers struggled to move quickly without being seen first. Clara knew this landscape, which surprised Nathaniel until he remembered that she had been traveling these routes for years, in all weathers, mostly alone. They spent the first night at a shepherd's bothy on the edge of the moors above Wensleydale, a single stone room with a hearth, a pile of peat, and a wooden bench that was considerably less comfortable than it appeared. Nathaniel built the fire. Clara sorted through the contents of her traveling coat with the systematic calm of someone taking inventory after a disaster. A small folded document she had kept on her person, 2 coins, a length of cord, a folding knife. He looked at the knife. "Did you always carry that?" "Since I was 19, she said, without elaboration. They sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate bread and said nothing for a while. The wind came off the moors in long, low sweeps that pressed against the walls of the bothy and made the peat smoke bend sideways in the chimney. Then Clara said, quietly, "I should tell you something." He waited. "The bridge on the Harrogate Road. I did not simply hear about it through the network." She kept her eyes on the fire. "My contact in Harrogate sent word that Hale's men had arranged for the foundations to be weakened, deliberately. You were the intended target." Nathaniel was very still. "They knew you had been asking questions about the northern shipments. A conversation at Lord Pembury's gathering. Someone heard you speaking to a customs officer and reported it." She paused. "I was already on that road for other reasons. When I understood what was planned, I waited." "In a storm," he said, "alone." "I was not certain you would stop," she admitted. "Dukes do not always stop for flower women." He looked at her across the fire. There was something stripped back about her in this place. No basket, no disguise, no servant's cap. Just a woman who had stood in the rain on a dark road to warn a man she did not know because it was the right thing to do, and who had carried the weight of an 11-year secret operation across the length of northern England without ever asking for recognition. "Your father," he said carefully. "What happened to him?" The fire shifted. She took a moment. "He was a customs clerk in Leeds. He found evidence of a large import fraud. Different men, years ago, but the same principle. Powerful people protecting profitable arrangements." Her voice was steady in the way that steadiness sometimes costs something. "He reported it through the proper channels. Within a month, he was dismissed on fabricated charges of misconduct. Within 6 months, he was dead. They called it fever." "Was it?" "No," she said simply. Nathaniel said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, so he did not attempt it. They sat in silence that was not uncomfortable, the fire burning between them, the moors pressing dark and enormous against the thin walls of the bothy. Later, when the peat had burned low and they had both shifted closer to the remaining warmth, Nathaniel found himself close enough to see the tiredness she kept out of her voice registering quietly in her face. He reached across and briefly covered her hand with his. She did not move away. Outside, the wind crossed the moors in the dark, and somewhere far below in the valley, the lights of a village burned small and steady against the vast black of the hills. Tomorrow they would ride for London. Tonight, for 1 hour at least, they were simply 2 people on the same side of a fire, and that was enough. They reached London on a Thursday. The city received them the way it received everyone, indifferently, noisily, its streets already thick with morning traffic by the time their horses crossed the Southwark Bridge approach. Cartwheels on cobblestones, street sellers calling, pigeons scattering from rooftops in grey clouds above the river. Nathaniel had always found London's indifference to individual arrivals oddly comforting. Today, it felt like cover. Margaret was already there. She had taken rooms above a printer's shop in Clerkenwell under a name Nathaniel was not given, and it was there that the three of them reunited on Thursday afternoon, around a table barely large enough for the documents Margaret spread across it. The originals. All of them, intact, supplemented by 3 additional pieces of evidence that members of the network had delivered in the past week. A second ledger, a witnessed account from a Durham dock worker written in a careful, unpracticed hand, and a letter signed by Major General Croft that removed any remaining ambiguity about the military dimension of the conspiracy. The case was complete. The question was who received it. This was the problem they had been circling for weeks. The conspirators had people inside government offices. Ellery's connections ran through at least 2 departments that handled northern affairs. Presenting evidence through official channels meant the very real possibility that it would reach the wrong desk first and disappear quietly, along with anyone who had delivered it. Clara had been working on this for longer than she had told Nathaniel. "There is a man," she said, "a parliamentary secretary named Aldous Graves, no relation to your steward. He has been approached twice by Ellery's intermediaries and refused both times. We know this because our woman in his household heard both conversations." "You trust him?" Nathaniel asked. "We trust that he refused money twice when accepting it would have been easy and undetectable," Margaret said. "In our experience, that is a more reliable indicator than reputation." Nathaniel met with Graves the following morning, alone, in the reading room of a private club on Pall Mall that Graves used regularly. He laid the evidence on the table in careful sequence, walking Graves through it methodically, watching the man's face move through skepticism and then something much more serious as the full picture assembled itself. Graves asked 3 sharp questions. Nathaniel answered all 3. Then Graves sat back and said, "How long do we have?" "Days," Nathaniel said. "Perhaps less. They know someone is moving against them. They will accelerate." He was right about that. The acceleration came the following morning, not as any of them had anticipated, which was the first genuine surprise in a situation that had contained several. Barstow moved first. 2 of the financial institutions central to the conspiracy's 3rd stage received forged documentation authorizing significant asset transfers, paperwork that bore the seals of government officers whose officials had been paid to look elsewhere. The transfers were designed to move before anyone realized the seals were fraudulent. Once the assets moved, the paper trail became complicated enough that prosecution became difficult. More critically, a motion appeared in parliamentary business that morning, quietly inserted, buried between routine matters, that would have given Ellery's associates administrative authority over northern land dispute resolutions. It was the legislative mechanism that made the entire scheme permanent. Passed quietly on a routine day, it would have attracted almost no attention. Almost. Margaret's women had been watching parliamentary business for a month. Word reached Clerkenwell before 10 in the morning. What followed across the next 6 hours was the most concentrated and least dignified period of Nathaniel's adult life. He moved between Graves's office, 2 separate locations where members of Clara's network arrived with corroborating witnesses, and a magistrate's chambers in the Strand, where a man of considerable legal standing examined the evidence with agonizing slowness, while Nathaniel stood by a window, watching the street below, with his hands clasped behind his back. Clara coordinated everything from Clerkenwell with a precision that made his own efforts feel clumsy by comparison. Witnesses arrived when they were needed. Documents appeared at the right desks at the right moments. The dock worker from Durham, a large, quiet man named Foster, who had clearly never been inside a government building before, gave his account with a plain, unshakable honesty that proved more persuasive than any legal argument. By 4 in the afternoon, the asset transfers had been halted. By 6, the parliamentary motion had been withdrawn from the day's business under circumstances that would require explanation. By 8 that evening, Ellery and Barstow were in custody. Croft was taken at his club in the middle of supper, which Nathaniel found he did not feel particularly sorry about. Hale and Presswick were located at a posting inn outside the city, attempting to leave it, which confirmed a great deal about their awareness of what was unfolding. Nathaniel sat in Graves's office as the evening quieted and read the formal statement that would go to the press the following morning. Clara's network was named in it, not individually, but as an organized intelligence service whose work had been instrumental in uncovering the conspiracy. Margaret had apparently negotiated this wording herself, directly with Graves, while Nathaniel had been standing in the magistrate's chambers, watching a man read slowly. He found Clara on the steps outside, her coat pulled close against the night air. "It is done," he said. She looked at the dark street for a moment. Then she turned to face him, and for the first time since a stormy crossroads in Yorkshire, he saw something in her expression that was not watchfulness or restraint or the careful composure of a woman operating under permanent pressure. She looked, simply, like herself. "It is done," she agreed. Above them, London carried on without pause, as it always did, entirely indifferent. But between them, standing on those steps in the cold November air, something had quietly and irrevocably settled. Like the last piece of a long and complicated journey, finally, after everything, finding its place. Spring came slowly to Yorkshire that year. March was cold and reluctant, the moors still brown and frostbitten well into the month. April arrived with rain that felt more like an extension of winter than any genuine change of season. But by mid-May, something shifted. The hedgerows along the Ashford Estate roads filled out almost overnight. The fields beyond the east wall turned a green so vivid it seemed almost aggressive after the long grey months. And in the south garden, where Nathaniel had quietly instructed his head groundsman to begin work in February, the rose beds came into bloom with a thoroughness that surprised even the groundsman himself. Nathaniel had spent the winter months doing something he had not done in years. He had been present. Not in the sense of simply occupying rooms in his own house, which he had done for a decade with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Present in the way that required actual attention to his tenants, to the estate business he had long delegated entirely to others, to the letters that came from Clara through the winter months as she worked in London alongside Margaret, establishing the formal structure of what the network was becoming. The Crown's arrangement with the courier organization had been settled in January after considerable negotiation that Nathaniel suspected Margaret had conducted with the same precise, unhurried authority she brought to everything else. The women who had operated invisibly for 11 years were now formally recognized, adequately funded, and structurally independent enough that their work could continue without the vulnerabilities that had nearly destroyed them. Clara had written to him about this with satisfaction, and something else beneath the satisfaction that he read several times before setting the letter down. He wrote back. She replied. The correspondence continued through February and March with a regularity that his housekeeper, Mrs. Pendleton, noted with visible approval, and the good sense not to mention directly. Clara arrived at Ashford Manor on a Friday, in the second week of May. She came without ceremony, in a plain travelling coach, wearing a sensible grey coat and carrying a single bag. Partridge met her at the door with the warmth of a man welcoming someone the house had been waiting for, which made Nathaniel suspect his staff had been collectively holding an opinion on this matter for some time. He met her in the entrance hall. There was a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, where they simply looked at one another, after the months of letters and distance and the long winter between them. Then she said his name, not his title, just his name, which she had never done before, and something that had been sitting tightly wound in his chest since November came quietly undone. He had planned to give her 2 days to rest before saying what he intended to say, He lasted until Saturday afternoon. The rose garden was at its best in the mid-afternoon light, the beds full and the air carrying that particular sweetness that only exists for a few weeks of the year before summer heat changes it into something heavier. They had walked there after a late luncheon, following the gravel path that curved around the south lawn. Nathaniel stopped near the center bed. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something small, a dried rose, its color faded from pale pink to a dusty cream, pressed flat and wrapped in a square of paper. He held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it immediately. "Where did this come from?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. "A crossroads outside Harrogate," he said. "In a rainstorm. You dropped several from your basket when you picked them up from the mud. I took one before I got back in the carriage." He paused. "I cannot fully explain why. I had known you for perhaps 4 minutes." Clara took the dried rose carefully and looked at it for a long moment. "I knew who you were before that night," she said quietly. "Your name had come through the network weeks earlier, someone reporting that a Yorkshire Duke had been asking uncomfortable questions about northern shipping irregularities. I was asked to assess whether you were a threat to our operations or a potential resource." She turned the rose over in her fingers. "I was not supposed to warn you about the bridge. That was not part of any instruction I had been given." "Why did you?" She looked up at him. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said, "which I realize is the same answer I gave you once before about something else entirely." "It is a consistent answer," he said. "I have come to rely on your consistency." She almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It is the beginning of one," he said. He took a breath and looked at her in the afternoon light, in the rose garden he had planted in February because he had needed something to do with the certainty he had been carrying since a cold November evening on a set of steps in London. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I will not follow you across 3 counties to change your mind." Clara laughed, properly, fully, the first time he had heard it without restraint. "Yes," she said, before he had finished the question. He stopped. "You do not know what I was going to ask." "Nathaniel," she said, still smiling, "I have been a courier and intelligence gatherer for 11 years. I know exactly what you were going to ask." He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed too, and it felt like something that had been away for a very long time finally coming home. The rose garden held them there in the May afternoon, and the estate spread out around them in every direction, fields and moors and the long Yorkshire sky, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Nathaniel Ashford felt the particular, uncomplicated contentment of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The wedding took place in June, on the longest day of the year. The church in the village below the estate held more people than it had seen in a generation. Tenant farmers beside viscounts, dock workers beside ladies, and somewhere near the back, a silver-haired woman named Margaret, who watched the proceedings with an expression of quiet satisfaction and left before the reception without speaking to anyone, which was entirely in keeping with her character. Clara carried white chrysanthemums,